Hey guys, it's Blair with Rotors, and today I'm going to show you what tools you'll need to change the front pads and rotors on a 2013 Hyundai Tucson. The first thing that you're going to obviously need is your jack stands, and a wheel chock. Then we have our dead blow hammer for removing the rotor, as well as a flat blade screwdriver for compressing the piston inside the caliper. We have a 1/2-inch ratchet. We have a impact socket remover, and that is what we use to remove the 2 Phillips head screwdrivers that you'll encounter to remove the rotor. We also use the 3/8 electric ratchet, which isn't necessary. We have our wire brush. We have a 21mm socket, which should be your factory size. We had to use a 19mm socket because one of the lug nuts has been changed. Then you'll need a 17mm socket for the back of the caliper bracket, and you're also going to need a 14mm socket for the caliper bolts themselves. Then we have our torque wrench, we have some thread locker, we have our anti-seize, our brake parts lubricant, our brake parts cleaner, and our impact gun itself. These are the tools you'll need to do the job. Enjoy the video. Hey guys, Blair from Rotors, and today I'm going to show you how you can replace your front brake pads and rotors on a 2013 Hyundai Tucson. Now the first thing you're going to want to do is put a wheel chuck on the opposite rear wheel of whatever side you're jacking up. So since we're working on the passenger front, we're going to put the wheel chuck on the driver's side rear. The next thing we're going to do is turn the steering wheel so that we can easily access the back of the brake parts here, and also so that you guys can take a look and see what we're doing. You can do this with the wheel and tire facing forward, but it makes it a little easier for me to capture this for you guys. So now I'm going to grab my 21mm socket impact wrench and buzz these guys off. If you're doing this at home without this tool, you want to make sure that you leave this car on the ground, set the parking brake, and break it loose with a 21mm socket and a breaker bar. Knock the wheel off and move it out of the way. So the next step is to compress your piston inside your caliper. And what you'll do is you'll go in between this little opening here with a flathead screwdriver and close it shut. And what this does is it compresses the piston inside the caliper. Makes it a lot easier to all go back together. Once that's done, you're going to go ahead and once that's completed, once you've compressed this piston, you can then go ahead and remove your 2 bolts that are holding on the caliper assembly itself. So using my 14mm, I'm going to loosen both sides first before I remove either of them. Then I'm going to take a bungee cord and put my bungee cord through the spring in the coil and hook it onto the caliper. Alrighty, so that's going to hold this out of the way because you don't want to have any tension on this brake hose. Now all we have to do is slide out our old pads, which still have some decent life on them. And then we're going to go ahead and remove the caliper bracket bolts. And these are 17mm. So now we're going to go ahead and remove the caliper mounting bracket, and it has two 17mm bolts that hold it on. I'm going to use my impact, but if you're doing this at home, you can just use a 1/2-inch breaker bar. Now, these bolts do have washers that you want to keep track of and not lose. So don't lose these washers. The next step happens back at the front, and you're going to remove two Phillips head screws that hold on the rotor itself. So to do this, they make a really cool little impact tool, but we're just going to use our 3/8 electric ratchet and pull it right off. Next step is to get a good dead blow hammer and hammer off the rotor. Once that's off, be sure to hit this with a wire brush. And I always like to put a little bit of anti-seize back here, because if we ever need to take the brakes off to service, let's say, this wheel bearing, we can do so without damaging the brake parts like we just did hitting it with a hammer. Now the next step is to start reassembling everything. So we're just going to grab our rotor and orient it so that the screw holes still line up. Then we're going to take our two small screws and set them back in. And then I'll just snug them up. Now before you go ahead and put this caliper bracket back on, you're going to want to twist these slide pins, make sure that they move in and out freely. These do, and I'm just going to go ahead and put some lubrication back on them, some grease, so that these still have a good service life. That's all you have to do there. And a little bit of grease goes a long way. So now that's done, we're going to go ahead and we're going to replace our anti-rattle clips. And all you do is you just pull them off like so. And then you get your wire brush out, and you just wire brush out any rust or grime that's built up in between the rattle clip and the caliper bracket itself. Then you grab your new hardware and you just reinstall it how it came off. Once these are on, you'll go ahead and put a little bit of blue thread locker on the back of your bolts. So just going on the threads here. And that's enough for 2. So I'm just gonna grab the other bolt and share the love. And I'm just gonna go put this back on. And then you'll want to torque these guys down. So I'm going to change viewpoints again so you can kind of see what we're doing. So now we're going to get back here and snug these guys up. And then hit this upper one too. Move this out of the way. And with our torque wrench, just check them to make sure that they are at the proper torque. Alrighty, and we'll just torque them down. So the next thing that I like to do is with my pinky, just get a tiny little piece of grease and just kind of very gently line the groove of the anti-rattle clip. And this is just a tiny amount. I'm not getting any onto the rotor. Then we grab our brake pads and we install those. So next I'm going to go ahead and put the brake pads back on. And I'm just going to put so. I've got the one in my wear tab on the outside right now. Now I'm just going to go ahead and put this one in as well. So I'm having a little trouble getting over top of this clip. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just push this clip back with this flathead screwdriver and get my top one in. And then do the same thing with this bottom one. So I can get this bottom one in. Now you can see that my pads are in. You can see my wear tab. And we're going to go ahead and put the caliper back on. So just grab your caliper. And your piston should be fully seated by doing the method that I showed you earlier. If it's not fully seated, you can use a pair of really big pliers to grab the front and the back and compress this piston, or you can use a C-clamp. There's a bunch of different tools that you can use, but if you use the screwdriver method at the beginning of this video, you won't have to do that. All you'll have to do is slip it over and get it down. Like so. Then I'm going to grab our 2 caliper bolts, these 2 little guys, and just put a little tiny bit of Loctite on them. And share that. And snug everything up. Next, we're just going to grab a little bit of brake parts cleaner and go around the rotor to clean off any sort of contaminants that I put on it through installation. After that, you're going to go ahead and put your wheel and tire back on. Once your wheel and tire is back on the car, you want to go around and just torque it all down to spec. And the very last step before you test drive your car is make sure to get in your car and depress the brake pedal several times until the brake pedal becomes very firm. If you try to drive right now, you're not going to have any stopping force because all the fluid has been pushed back out of the piston. Now that we have this real strong pedal, everything's filled back up and we'll be able to take it for a test drive. So be sure to do this before you take it for a test drive.